During 6 months of campaigning, including door-knocking over 9,000 homes, one of the most common complaints was that neither the state or federal governments showed any clear vision for the future. No business operates without serious consideration for its plans for the future. What is our master plan? Where will we be in 50 years? One of the big issues confronting my electorate is population density. Community organisations like RAID, Mars and Capo have sprouted up from the grassroots to challenge the overcrowding and overdevelopment with little consideration to infrastructure planning. In their maiden speeches, so many of my colleagues have talked about these coinciding dynamics on a collision course in their own electorates. There has been talk in the past of decentralisation and a conversion from the lucky country to the clever country, but little has been achieved. It is now time for us to make our own luck and not squander our inheritance. We must look beyond 3-year cycles and embrace long-term vision. The growth of our 2 largest cities has been disproportionate to the rest of the country, and infrastructure development has not kept pace. It is outrageous when you consider that the air corridor between Sydney and Melbourne is the 4th busiest in the world, and yet the highway linking these 2 cities is still not 4 lanes all the way. And the railway line reduces to a single one-way track for parts of this journey. The current path of relentless expansion of 2 or 3 cities and a little more than welfare mentality of handouts to regional areas is simply not sustainable. By partnering with business, planning long-term infrastructure programs, government can help develop a far better outcome for our citizens. Through this comes sustainable economic development for those regions, allowing them to lift themselves up and stand on their own strong, proud feet. Sydney and Melbourne will remain our 2 greatest cities. This greatness should not be judged by population and size, but by livability and efficiency. If we continue to focus our growth largely on these 2 cities, we are limited by how much we as a nation can grow. If through infrastructure we can encourage the development of tens of cities, our potential of growth is enhanced commensurately. Strategic long-term planning is essential for optimal growth.
Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimise their tax. They want their heads rigged.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
The answer is Mike, because I want to do you slowly. I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this. And if you are watching this live, as always, you can contribute to tonight's conversation in the chat. And the link to StreamYard is also there if you want to call in and have your say at some point tonight. But let's kick things off the way that we always do. And that's by letting you know how you can support us here at Commanding the Narrative. And it's by heading to commandingthenarrative.com. You can hit the donate button in the top right-hand corner. Some people like to go and buy me a coffee and donate to us there, or some people like to take the direct route, just like John Holmes did this week. Now, John sent us a very lovely note and $1,000 donation. Can you believe that? And if you don't believe that, well, John's done it before as well. This is his second $1,000 donation. And he said this in his note. He said, keep up the good work as this country is going to SHIT. And we need more people like you and your team. Love your posts on Facebook and listen to as many of them as I can. Well, thank you very much, John. That contribution helps to pay for the stream, helps to pay for the website, and most importantly, gives me a very, very warm and fuzzy feeling inside. And your contribution blows me away. Thank you very much for following us and supporting us. While you're there at commandingthenarrative.com, you can also head to our main page, and you'll get all the podcasts that we've done recently, all the articles and newsletters that I might write and contribute to, and also upcoming events. If you want to know who's going to be on the podcast this week, it's all at commandingthenarrative.com. All you need to do is hit that button in the top right-hand corner, the sign up button, and you'll get that regular newsletter. Now, last Sunday, we also had a big event for Australians for Better Government, the Warrior Club. It was a very successful event. It was great to see everyone there, and it was great to hear from great speakers. If you head to australiansforbetter.com, you'll get to see the footage here of Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Lockery, Darren DeBortley, the Managing Director of DeBortley Wines, the Honourable John Ruddick, myself, and also Councillor Adam Zara. We all spoke. They're all great speeches. Please head to australiansforbetter.com if you want to check out the footage from that event. And while you're there, also sign up to be a member. We're getting a lot of people reaching out to us, wanting to find out more about Australians for Better Government and what we stand for. It's all there on the website. I encourage you to go there and sign up and check that out. Now, on tonight's episode, this is something that I've been looking forward to talking about for a very, very long time. I've been trying to track down our guest for a very, very long time, and it was actually through a conversation I had with Warwick Stacey, who actually became Australia's new senator this week for One Nation. So congratulations to Warwick. But Warwick had the contact for John Alexander, who I heard interviewed a long time ago, a few years ago now, talking about high-speed rail. And John Alexander's been a strong advocate for high-speed rail for a very long time. It's a big issue that I want to advocate for as well. I think it's something that needs to happen here in Australia, and I want to talk about it tonight. So very privileged to have John Alexander on the show. He's a champion tennis player and commentator. He's been awarded the Order of Australia Medal, and he was elected to the seat of Bennelong in 2010. He held that to 2022. The significance of Bennelong is that it was formerly John Howard's seat. So it's a very sought after electorate in Sydney. And he's also, while John Alexander was in Parliament, he chaired several parliamentary committees and inquiries on infrastructure, housing, taxation, tourism. And that's just to mention a few. I could talk all day about all the positions he chaired. So let's bring him on. John Alexander, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Well, good evening, Stephen. And thanks to Warwick Stacey, my old mate, for putting us together. Warwick and I go back to probably to about 2010 when he helped us in campaigning in Bennelong, and my warmest congratulations to him to be in the Senate. He is a very good person, highly intelligent, and a very hard worker. So you couldn't have a better person than Warwick Stacey.
He's a good man, and I think he's going to be a very, very good senator. What do you think?
Definitely. He's got his heart in the right place. He was often frustrated by the political system, as I guess I was also, that it was so hard to get things done, to get our leaders to concentrate on policy. And that was what had lured me into politics to begin with, when I met with John Howard. And essentially what he said was that a party should only win government by the presentation of better policies. And if they're fortunate enough to get into government, they should only hold government by the delivery of the promise of those policies. And I thought good policy and having an arena to build on those policies, to have a contest of ideas would be the ideal. Unfortunately, our question time and the political debate is so often just a denigration of each other and not productive at all.
Now, we saw parts of your maiden speech in the cold open at the beginning of the show. This is not, we're going to be talking about high-speed rail tonight, but it goes into so many other areas as well. Housing, it talks about decentralising our major cities. There's a bit of taxation and value capture talk in there. It's a big, massive issue, and it could really revolutionise our country. But you made it a big part of your maiden speech. So you obviously had this issue in your mind as you went into Parliament, before you went into Parliament. What drew you to this in the beginning? How did you develop an interest in high-speed rail?
Well, I actually didn't have any interest in high-speed rail per se. When I was first in Parliament, I formed a task force on sustainable cities, and we tried not to be prescriptive, but it was inescapable that to actually develop sustainable cities and to strategically decentralise, to take the pressure off our two major cities, where we had amongst the most costly real estate in the world, which is ridiculous when our biggest asset is real estate, where congestion and inefficiencies and lack of productivity were growing exponentially because of infrastructure not keeping pace with the growth of these cities. And now these cities, especially Sydney, we see billions and billions of dollars being spent on the retrofitting of infrastructure, trying to catch up. It is time that we planned settlement. High-speed rail, in our group, the Australian High-Speed Rail Association, we actually have banned the mentioning of high-speed rail. We talk about housing supply. We talk about easing congestion on our major cities. We talk about affordable housing. We talk about the lowering of CO2 emissions. The greatest reduction in CO2 emissions will happen not through getting the aeroplanes out of the sky when you have high-speed rail going from Sydney to Melbourne, which is the second busiest air corridor in the world now, but it's when you move the next million people, 80% of which would be going into Sydney and Melbourne, which are really polluting cities. They're coal-guzzling cities, into smart, green, energy-efficient cities that are linked by high-speed rail to our great two cities.
You spoke of Sydney and Melbourne having to play catch up. I work in construction. I'm a surveyor, so I work on a lot of these big infrastructure projects happening in Sydney right now. And the catch up process is you're basically trying to build major roads or light rail or other things in areas where you've got live traffic and roads currently existing. And that creates a very technical and problematic scenario where you're having to interface with the general public, people in houses around, and also the traffic on the roads. It just makes these projects blow out in one cost, but also time, like the time that is wasted having to, work in small areas and only work at night or whatever it might be. It causes a big problem. Whereas what you're saying is if we were to develop areas outside of Sydney and Melbourne, it would be much easier to do that. And a lot of these routes that the high-speed rail would take would be what they call green zones, green areas, green pastures where there's nothing else around, and the construction crews can just go in there and do the work quite quickly. I want to bring up, before we start going back to your time in Parliament and what you worked through on some of the committees that you worked on, I want to talk about the current day and what's being proposed now. Now, this is the High-Speed Rail Authority website. And this is what's being proposed at the moment. So they're talking about a link between Sydney and Newcastle. It's going to be trains with speeds of 320 kilometers per hour. And the current progress is that the Sydney to Newcastle corridor is currently being proposed. So it's only proposed at this point as the first phase of the East Coast high-speed rail network that would be delivered. The authority presented the business case to the Australian government in December 2024. The business case is currently being assessed by Infrastructure Australia. So when you look at that, and considering all the work that you've done on this in the past, do you think this is the best path forward initially? Is Sydney to Newcastle the best route to be constructed first? And maybe the other question we can talk about after that is the speed of these trains.
Well, there was 3 inquiries: harnessing value, delivering infrastructure, building up and moving out, and fairer funding and financing of faster rail. There was not one dissenting report from any of those 3 parliamentary inquiries. And for a political decision to be made to have it go from Central in Sydney to Broadmeadows in Newcastle is diametrically opposed to the recommendations of those 3 inquiries. The most important thing to fund high-speed rail, the only way high-speed rail has been funded anywhere in the world is through value capture. And the choice of site for where those stations go has to be where you can achieve the maximum uplift in the value of the land through the infrastructure and the accompanying zoning. At Central, there is very little chance to build up as far as our build up and move out goes. And Broadmeadows is okay, but it's not great. And where they've got the train station going to Gosford is absolutely an absurd choice. It's obviously been made by people who didn't look at these inquiries, where we had world experts giving their best advice, their evidence. We produced the findings from that evidence and then the recommendations. But simply, you've got to place the train stations where you can zone around to create enormous uplift. So most people agree that the terminal for high-speed rail should be at Homebush Bay, where you can create a whole new CBD. Also, being west of the CBD, it'll be cheaper to get out of Sydney, and the cost of tunnelling, which is just astronomical, going from Central through to Gosford and then on to Newcastle. You'd have a more affordable route. But it's also contrary to the 2013 inquiry, which was headed up by study that was headed up by Anthony Albanese as the Minister for Infrastructure at the time, which recommended that the first place should be going from Sydney to Canberra. But there was a very interesting comment made by Philip Lowe some years ago when he was asked a question, what should be done to facilitate major infrastructure? And his answer was very, very insightful. He said that if 40 years ago somebody would have told you that my board and I would set the prime rate of interest at arm's length from government, people would have laughed at you. But that's what we do, and it works very well. And that's what has to happen for major infrastructure projects to be brought into reality. And to think that a group of politicians decided that it's going to be Sydney to Newcastle, and then you get an authority to then run with this plan. It's like fighting Muhammad Ali with one hand behind your back. It's silly. You should have an independent authority that really does assess where these things should go. Take into consideration, you must take into consideration the opportunity to value capture fund. This is a fundable infrastructure. In fact, not only fundable, it makes profit over a period of time, as it has done through the evidence that we had in building up, moving out from Korea, Japan, and China, where fabulous amounts of money are made through real estate development, where you put the train station on a greenfield site and bring that into a commutable time to a major urban area, which can happen from Gosford, can happen from Newcastle, but it need not be going into Central. It can happen for the Southern Highlands and for Goulburn, where you could find a location where you can create a 1 million people city in time. The evidence that we got from fairer funding and financing of faster rail was phenomenal. It looked at, we had a lot of evidence from Badgerys Creek looking at the impact of that infrastructure on land values. And it was phenomenal evidence. Ron Medich, who's well known, had bought some land with his brother for $3 million. And after the announcement of the airport and the train stations, whatever else, sold it for $500 million. It's a big uplift, but there was no value capture of that. One of our realizations after that inquiry was that if the laws of the ACT applied to value capturing around Badgerys Creek Airport, the uplift would have funded, taking 75%, which is what happens in the ACT when land is rezoned, would have funded the airport, the trains, the train stations, and the various other pieces of infrastructure. So it was a missed opportunity. And that inquiry was done out of concern that if we went ahead and built high-speed rail, that we would be repeating this sad situation time and time again. And the other injustice of this is that you've got taxpayers funding the getting wealthy of the landowners and the speculators. It's so unjust. It should really, really anger the taxpayer.
I want to go into value capturing in a moment and do a deep dive on that. But when you talk about these 3 inquiries that were done, and I think you gave me a figure when we spoke on the phone the other day of $140 million in inquiries over 40 years that has gone into this. So money has been spent. Taxpayers' money has already been spent on this. What happens? Like, how do we get from 3 inquiries that are suggesting one plan and talking to experts about it, as you said, and suddenly we get this route from Sydney to Newcastle through Central, and whereas you're proposing it should come out of Homebush, and I've also heard proposals or read about proposals in the research that it should maybe go to Badgerys Creek as well, and that could be an option.
There's no question that the route that comes from Melbourne to Canberra to Sydney must service Badgerys Creek. We looked at the opportunity of being able to get on a high-speed rail at Goulburn and be at Badgerys Creek within about 20 minutes. You could be checking in on the train and going through passport control on the train. You could literally be from your office in Goulburn to on a plane within an hour. Whereas to get an international flight in Sydney, you've got to be there about 3 hours in advance. So it would make Goulburn a international city and therefore, of far greater value.
I think about Goulburn because I remember that interview that you did with Alan Jones that I listened to a few years ago, and you were talking about it might take half an hour from Goulburn into Central on a high-speed rail. Now, I used to work out in the Blue Mountains. I'd be driving from Sydney out there, going against traffic every morning, and I'd see all these people sitting in traffic from Penrith and Emu Plains and Mount Druitt and areas like that, Parramatta, trying to get into Sydney and just being gridlocked the whole way. And they must spend like over an hour in traffic. I can just imagine some of those people going, yeah, I'll live in Goulburn if it's only in a half-hour train ride into the city to go to work, and they could get cheaper property there, maybe live in a big house instead of a unit in Sydney. I mean, this is a tremendous opportunity to move people out of our big cities to regional areas through high-speed rail. Why is there no appetite from politicians to do this? You would think that they would jump at this chance.
Well, if you watch the program Nemesis, you'd probably get the idea that they spend a lot of time fighting within their own parties, fighting against their factions, fighting against each other, denigrating each other. I was at a loss when I watched that program to see where was the time being spent to develop visions, ideas, projects that would address our problems of a shortage of housing. We've got a housing shortage, affordability. Where is that being addressed? Where are these things being worked on? Where do you work on to reduce the congestion and the cost of housing in Sydney and Melbourne and create affordable housing in these regions? That's why we did the inquiry, building up and moving out. Essentially, we're talking about building up was densification around transport hubs in our major cities, but far more importantly was the strategic decentralisation. Gough Whitlam in the 70s had a plan of decentralisation, but it wasn't strategic. The strategic comes from the facility of high-speed rail, where you can develop a number of cities that interact with each other during their infancy until they become of a critical mass that makes them sustainable cities in their own right, albeit with ready access to the major mega areas of Sydney and Melbourne, mega regions.
Now, we've spoken of Goulburn and Newcastle. Were there any other regional areas that were identified as potential stops along this route for a potential high-speed rail?
Oh, certainly. You can look at 6 or 7 between Melbourne and Sydney, from Shepparton to Albury, Gundagai, one round Canberra that would service the Tri-City area of Canberra, Queanbeyan and Yass. Goulburn, obviously, Southern Highlands and into Sydney.
And look, I just like, we look at countries around the world. I know you spoke to the Japanese about this, and you look to different parts of the world that already have high-speed rail and have had high-speed rail for decades. I mean, Australia has got a lot of land, There's a lot of greenfield areas that would make it easy to construct, and it's very flat as well in a lot of areas. There's no real restrictions in my mind, at least. You might have found some. There's no real restrictions to holding us back from the construction phase of this, is there?
Now, look, every year that I was in Parliament, I would meet with either the Minister for Infrastructure or the Shadow Minister and plead with them, please take action to reserve the corridor, because every year that went by where the corridor for high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane wasn't reserved, the price went up phenomenally, and housing gets built, and then the cost of getting that land back is prohibitively high. We used to have a saying regarding the retrofitting of infrastructure in Sydney, when the cost of acquiring the land was too high, we went to look at tunnelling, and when tunnelling costs were too high, we did nothing, and we did nothing an awful lot of the time. There has been an extraordinary amount of money spent on tunnelling in Sydney in recent decades, but it's a patch-up to address the sins of the past. When are we going to learn that we've got to not be reactive, you've got to be proactive? You have to plan. You have to plan the settlement. You have to plan the infrastructure. The capacity of our housing, we've got a housing shortage. When you look at strategic decentralisation, where you can create more and more housing, it's so far-reaching because immigration should be calibrated to the capacity to house. It's absurd to have 600,000 people coming into this country when we've got a housing shortage this year. The fundamentals that should be at play is that housing supply must be calibrated to immigration. And you might have to pause immigration until you can crack on with housing supply through a strategic decentralisation where you can have major housing production in these regional areas that are serviced by high-speed rail.
And one thing that gets overlooked is tourism. I saw a figure there that it could take 2 hours between Sydney and Melbourne on a high-speed rail. Even if it's 4 hours, it's not all that long. Just imagine a big sporting event happening down in Melbourne where you get a flood of people from Sydney. Just jump on the train and go down there, or Newcastle. You want one of your footy teams is playing against Newcastle, and you can just hop on a train and get up there in half an hour. Tourism is overlooked in all of this as well. I mean, the money that could be generated through that is a big deal.
Well, this is one of the some of the evidence that came from the high-speed rail experience in Spain. Spain has the second most high-speed rail of anywhere in the world to China, and while they built it with the idea of linking cities together and strategically decentralizing, they found out that their traffic on weekends was beyond any expectation, because it did exactly as you were saying, Stephen. It liberated people to go to these beach areas on high-speed rail, and where they previously wouldn't have done it because the only alternative was probably to drive or to fly, and it wasn't worthwhile. But to the convenience and the affordability of high-speed rail liberated these places. I mean, I put forward to the Brisbane Olympics, why don't Shingo Yamagami, the ambassador from Japan, who spoke beautifully at the press club about wanting to partner with Australia, and that offer was never taken up by anyone in government, which was extraordinary. But the 64 Olympics launched high-speed rail in Japan. That was the legacy. And I wrote to Andrew Leveris to say, couldn't we have the legacy of high-speed rail for the Brisbane Olympics coming up, and have high-speed rail going from the Sunshine Coast to Brisbane, and Brisbane to the Gold Coast, to ferry the athletes and the spectators to both those places? Because the gridlock on the roads between the Gold Coast and Brisbane, I mean, you could see athletes, if they're thinking they're going to go from Brisbane to the Gold Coast for an event, not making it in time.
Yeah, well, just imagine if there was a high-speed rail between Sydney and Brisbane, and you were thinking, oh, maybe I'll go to the Olympics, mate. But it's a bit far. But then suddenly, one of the athletes that you support is suddenly in a final, and you go, I have to be there. You could just jump on the high-speed rail, and it's not the inconvenience of having to go to an airport and check in and be there half an hour early. You can just jump on the train and be there. It just, to me, I don't understand. Like I can understand how you're so behind this, but I can't understand how the politicians are not behind this. Like Anthony Albanese was infrastructure. He was minister and a shadow minister for infrastructure. Like, you would think that he would say, okay, let's put a stake in the ground and say, this is going to be a legacy of my government to go ahead with this. Why don't they jump on this?
Well, as soon as something is in the political arena, it will be killed. And that's why Philip Lowe said, you need to have an independent authority. Whatever is put up in the nature of discourse between our major parties will die on that altar of combat. It needs to be separated so it can be independently assessed and at arm's length from politics and political influence, where their only victory is to denigrate the other side and stop them from doing something. You end up with a contest of just whoever's isn't the biggest loser wins, but they don't win much. But this is what, in my experience in the 11 years that I was in Parliament, I would think most of the people I spoke to in Bennelong, and I spoke to a lot, you do when you're a member of Parliament, they wouldn't have known or wouldn't have cared which party I was with, but they loved engaging in conversations about ideas. I've attacked any number of times. Why are you always talking about a high-speed rail? What's it got to do with us? And I explained that the biggest concern was congestion and overdevelopment. And the overdevelopment begets the congestion and the housing prices. And so I then explained, well, with high-speed rail, we could strategically decentralise instead of the next a good portion of the next million people coming into Bennelong and having more high-rise around wherever, unplanned, more tunnels being built, more congestion, more road congestion, and even on weekends. These people would be moving to, these immigrants would be moving largely to regional areas and allowing us to a little rest period to rebuild our infrastructure and catch up. Without the pouring fuel on the fire as we are. We're bringing more and more people in while we're trying to catch up with the housing shortage that we already have.
Yeah, it's mission impossible. Now let's talk about paying for it. So you've spoken about value capturing. A lot of people listening will probably not understand what that is, but basically it's taking the value that could be generated by announcing an infrastructure project in a certain area and basically taking a piece of that I guess capital gain. Do you want to expand upon that? Because there's a number of different ways to do it as well. Is that right?
Yes. We had some great evidence from Professor Andrew McNaughton from High Speed Rail 2 in the UK, who's a great champion of value capture and the opportunities that we have for value capture in Australia, because we have the perfect precondition in that we've got very low value, low cost land in this corridor between Sydney and Melbourne, and very, very high cost housing in Sydney and Melbourne. So it is a perfect precondition. But essentially what you're looking at is that when the unearned beneficiary should contribute to the cost of the infrastructure that gives them their benefit. So for instance, someone has bought 100 acres 10 years ago, $100 an acre just outside of Goulburn, and the train station is now going to go right in the middle of this lucky person's farm. And farmland, we found, went in Badgerys Creek from $2,000 an acre to as much as $40 million an acre when it's within 600 metres of a metro train station.
Wow.
The uplifts are fantastic. I spoke at a business conference in Sydney one day, and I was meant to be speaking about value capture. And I thought I'll just start off. I said, does everybody know what value capture is? 4 people in 200, over 200, put their hand up, and I reckon 3 of them were praying that I wasn't going to ask them to explain what value capture was, because they'd gone on the bluff. They didn't have an idea. I've talked to senior people in our government, and I was rebuffed by saying, pathetic rebuff, we're not in the business of buying the land. I'm saying you don't have to buy the land. But this farmer who's got 100 acres that he's paid $100,000 for, even if it's just divided into 400 building sites, so you've got 400 quarter-acre lots, and they're $500,000 each, that's 200 million. In Canberra, the 75% impost would give 150 million to the government, and that person who had paid 100,000 is walking away with 50 million. Are they still not happy? I think they should be happy. They'd have to pay capital gains tax on that. But we worked out that if those laws in the ACT had applied to Badgerys Creek, the airport would have been paid for by that impost. It is so important. As Andrew McNaughton finished his evidence by saying, and he made this final plea, he said, before you make any announcements on where the train stations might be located, you must determine the value of the land that there may be charges made on, because 1 minute after the announcement of where the train station goes, it's too late. The price has already gone through the roof. What happened the next day? The 5 stations between St. Mary's and Badgerys Creek Airport were announced. And those lucky landowners, speculators, and whoever else they were, made money on the back of the taxpayer. The taxpayer has invested the money, and these people have made a fortune. I'm not against people making a fortune. That's great. But when you invest the taxpayer's money, they should get a fair return. And this, everybody can win if the value capture mechanism is put in place and is well understood and appreciated, and it actually facilitates, it funds the cost, the full cost and more of high-speed rail going from Sydney to Melbourne. And when you look at going from, we used to say from Nowra to Noosa, that has to be the most desirable strip of real estate in the world, when you have places like Ballina and Coffs Harbour and Port Macquarie and Newcastle and Taree all linked with high-speed rail and interlinked with high-speed rail. The growth in that corridor will be phenomenal. The growth, of our population will be, beautifully housed and affordably housed, and there's other things you got to do with this affordability. But this is a mechanism. The absence of having value capture is a mechanism that actually concentrates wealth amongst a few people at the cost of all taxpayers, and that's just not Australian. It's very similar to just to divert to the negative gearing that enslaves the renter to renting a property that is actually paying the landlord to get rich. It's a mechanism to concentrate the wealth amongst the landlords at the cost of the renter. So you've got the cost of the renter, you've got these two extraordinary mechanisms in place through the absence of value capture that's concentrating wealth amongst landowners and speculators. And then you've got the other mechanism that is concentrating wealth amongst the landlords at the expense of the renter, denying our next generation of having a stake in Australia. And if you can't address that because of politics, you'll have to put that into Philip Lowe's independent think tank or action tank, or the equivalent of a reserve bank, to make those decisions, because it wasn't even touched at the last election. And talk about the last election, there was no vision, there was no passion. Where was this is a country that's got enormous opportunities of potential, and was there anything lighting our fire? No.
And it's a good point that you raise, because a lot of this work has already been done. When you talk about value capture, it's not just hocus pocus. Like here's a report from Infrastructure Australia, that a detailed report. It goes right through it. This is from December 2016. The work's been done. This has been paid for already. The arguments have been made. All politicians need to do is dust this off and have a read through it, and suddenly they've got a policy to move forward with.
MTR in Hong Kong fully fund their rail system. MTR are employed in Victoria Rail, but not to do the value capture, not to fund the building of the of the rail and funding it through development around those train stations. The Korean high-speed rail, South Korean high-speed rail, is the MTR model with a couple of little additions. It's the perfect model for Australia to adopt. Their evidence was magnificent. You just take it to the bank, put it in, and draw interest on it. There's the blueprint for us to follow. And yet, so often when, if I got the conversations and people just want to attack you and say it's a lousy idea, oh, it's too expensive. I had lots of people say too expensive. They didn't know what they're talking about. No, it will not be. It's not an operational business. It won't ever be paid for. It's not paid for anywhere else in the world by the price of the ticket. It is paid for. The capital expenditure is paid for by the uplift of the value of the land that is created as these cities grow and grow and grow. And decades later, you will still be clipping that ticket and getting more revenues in as the suburbs of these new cities grow further and further and further, and more land is rezoned for housing 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years into the future, long after the cost of the high-speed rail capital expenditure has been paid for.
When you say that, is that through land tax?
Well, politicians don't want to ever say they're introducing a tax. It is a charge when you own the land and you are an unearned beneficiary. That is through government expenditure in infrastructure and rezoning makes your land worth extraordinarily more than what it was before. Then it's subject to a charge. In Canberra, when land is rezoned, it's subject to a 75% impost. You can call it whatever you want. If you're growing up, okay, it's a tax, but it's a proper tax. It should be taxed. It's the tax. Why should the taxpayer fund the high-speed rail, pay for it out of consolidated revenues, to have these landowners who may know that this is coming or may not? They might just be lucky. Yep, they might be lucky. And they make these phenomenal amounts of money. We're talking about billions of dollars of uplift in some of these land holdings.
And I think about, I've had conversations with people in rural areas, and they look at a project like the West Connects in Sydney, and they go, well, my tax dollars are going towards infrastructure in Sydney, and we don't even have a sealed roads out here in my local town. So value capture is isolated as well. If you're going to build an infrastructure project in an area, then that area funds it through value capture, and the rest of the state doesn't have an impact upon them for that. Am I on the right path when I say that?
Absolutely. That person should feel absolutely cheated. Their money is going into infrastructure somewhere else that doesn't give them a benefit. And the third entity, the landowner, is the one who's walking away with the profit. Thank you very much. The beauty of strategic decentralisation is that there'll be so many regions that are now serviced by these cities that are now of a critical mass that can provide you with the medical, educational, business opportunities much closer. You won't have to go to Sydney or Melbourne to get to them. If you can imagine Queanbeyan, Yass, Canberra growing to being 1 million people, going to be over a period of time of 2 million people, the benefit to that entire region. How does Gundagai get on then? It's like 15 minutes up the road on high-speed rail to get to this mega region. It's fantastic. But you've got to have a plan of settlement. You've got to understand what is the purpose of high-speed rail. It's not as good as, it is the busiest air corridor in the world. Sydney to Melbourne is the busiest air corridor in the world over land. So it's the number one candidate to have high-speed rail. You'll get great occupancy on high-speed rail. But the real beneficiary is the relieving of cost and congestion to our major cities, the reduction of CO2 emissions, and the prosperity that is brought to the regions. With no plan of settlement, we've had a concentration of growth in our major cities at the cost of the regions that are dying, and the kids move out because there's not the opportunities. That can be reversed through an intelligent plan of rebalancing our settlement. And I hate to have to mention it, the essential infrastructure is high-speed rail.
And it's not like this hasn't happened in Australia before. I understand when they built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, there was a betterment tax or something along those lines. Where
That's right. It was funded, and then political forces took away that funding at a later stage. But initially, it was funded through a form of value capture. The train, I think it was the train line and the water move from Perth to Kalgoorlie, was funded through value capture, the same system that Abraham Lincoln used to fund the East Coast to the West Coast rail in the United States at about the same time too.
We've got a question from Palo. John, is that a once only is that a once only cost or unrealized gain every year when this value capture comes in on a property?
No, it will continue until you get to the final use. So you might have someone a farmer who owns some land, and the smart investor has come along and offered him 10 times the value of the land. So instead of 100,000, he's offered him $1 million. So the farmer sells. Then that person sells it on for maybe 200 million, and it's divided into housing blocks. Well, that 200 million would also be subject to value capture, but after that, there is no more charge. If your house goes up in value because you're close to high-speed rail, there is no value capture on your residence. There is no value capture on the residents of a town that is benefiting. So if you've got a lovely house in Goulburn, it's a beautiful place to be. I played tennis there in my youth. What a great place. And used to have a great Chinese restaurant on the main street, I remember. But they have a windfall. Their houses will double and maybe triple in value. Great. It's their house. There's no value capture will be applied to that. It's when you've got land that is changed in use. You've got a farm and now it's going to be rezoned. That's the trigger, is the rezoning of the land for high density housing and industrial or whatever else it might be.
So I guess to really dumb it down for people that still don't understand, when you announce infrastructure project, the high-speed rail is the best example here, and it's going to go through regional areas like, say, Goulburn or towns around there that are going to receive a tremendous amount of upgrade by having this piece of infrastructure there. There's going to be more housing. There's going to be better schooling and more attractive for people to live there. It's going to grow the population. As that happens, with the increased population and more housing, the land prices will go up. The housing prices will go up. Basically, you're clipping that capital gain from all that housing, that's the capital gain that's increased from the infrastructure being there. Is that basically what it is?
So the location of a train station should be outside of a Goulburn on a greenfield site. So you're going to be taking land from a minimal value to round the station, very high density, very high level, half an hour from Sydney, 35 minutes from Sydney, then high density residential around that, and then residential, and those suburban areas grow into the original town of Goulburn and seamlessly connects. And that's the planning. Having talked to every city between Sydney and Melbourne in my first few years in Parliament, they all wanted high-speed rail connectivity. They didn't necessarily want it going right into the middle of their township, and nor should it. But to give, if you look at the hamlets of the Southern Highlands from Mossvale and Barrel and Metagong and Berrima and Penrose and all those lovely little towns, they don't want the high-speed rail going into the middle of their town, but they want to have a 5 or 10 or 15-minute drive to the high-speed rail station so they can get into Sydney or go to Canberra, whatever they want to do. And so they are enormous beneficiaries, but it's the land that's zoned on those green spaces that is the trigger to the impost of the value capture mechanism. And they all win. Everybody wins. The landowner wins. The speculator who's gotten in there wins. I often think it's like when we in the United States, when they had prohibition, and then when prohibition ended, it was the same people making the booze, but now they had to pay tax instead of other protection monies and things like that. The business went on. And I think when the speculators and those people realize, well, we're not going to be out of business, we're going to go legit, it's not a bad thing. And developers should love it, because what you're going to give them is you're giving them the infrastructure, and you're giving them the zoning, and you're giving them the planning approval. You're fast tracking the opportunity for them to go about their business and develop these new cities and these new suburbs.
So in other words, the speculators will still be making their money. They just won't make as much money.
Well, if you look at Ron Medich, who made, rounded off 500 million, and if he'd paid 75%, so that's what, just shy of 400 million, if my maths is right, he'd still would have walked away with over 100 million. Ron, you're doing really well still.
Well, to play devil's advocate, we get a lot of libertarians listening to this show, and I'm sure they're screaming at the TV right now saying, if you own a property, the government shouldn't be able to come in and, you got to protect property rights, and we're already paying stamp duty and capital gains tax and blah, blah, blah. What would you say to that in terms of protecting property rights? And if someone buys a property, then they shouldn't.
You've bought your farm, it's yours. It gets rezoned, it's now worth 100 million, whatever. It's yours. You don't have to sell it. But when you do, your 100,000 becomes 100 million, and you'll pay a tax. You'll walk away with 25 million. Most people would be very, very happy with 25 million for an investment of 100,000. They might have only put 20,000 down and borrowed 80,000. It gets even better. I've had any number of conversations, and people say, oh no, I should get it all. I shouldn't have to pay any tax. Oh, don't worry. Look, we've got a guy over here. We can put the station over there, and he'll get the 100 million for his 100 acres. Oh, no. I want it. All of a sudden, they're very happy to pay the tax.
Yeah, very good. All right, let's talk about decentralisation. So we've spoken about Goulburn. We've used that as an example. When I spoke to you on the phone, you wanted to talk a little bit about Newcastle as well and the opportunities for Newcastle. Why do you see Newcastle being a city that could be developed, and you're saying that there's no limit to how far Newcastle can grow?
Well, Newcastle has the benefit that, one, it's already there. It's got an amount of infrastructure and services. It's about 250 or 300,000 people. It has no geographic boundaries as Sydney does. And it doesn't have the handicap that there is 5 million people and 5 million houses and whatever else that you've got to compulsory acquire at great cost, which makes everything incredibly expensive. Newcastle and the Lake Macquarie area, and we met with the Newcastle mayor and the mayor from Lake Macquarie, who were great people and saw this vision and really wanted to embrace it. But that has the opportunity, the potential of being a bigger urban area than Sydney, because it doesn't have these restrictions. And you've got the advantage, it should be being planned now to be a 5, 6, 7 million people area within 40 minutes of Sydney. So then you've got 12, 13 million people, and Gosford becomes, Wyong, that Arimba area becomes a 2, 3 million people area. And then you link it to Goulburn and the Southern Highlands. You're looking at getting 15 to 20 million people, and they're all within about 40 minutes of the central place. It is a mega region, and that's what is required for Australia to be competitive on the world stage. It's a great vision. It's not just mine. This is years and years of inquiries where I'm just the fortunate one who's there and gathering this information, and our team assembled it. The Secretariat was great at doing that work, and really they were enthused, because they're all people who were struggling to buy houses and struggle with the cost of living, and we had a family who had a family member who had Parkinson's, and there was not one Parkinson's nurse in Canberra. Had to go to Sydney to get assistance because there wasn't the critical mass. These little anecdotal things that tells you, gee, we need to have cities that are sustainable, that have that critical mass that can provide all of those services and more to those regions, to, as Shingo Yamagami said, to allow the regions to prosper.
Now, just to go back to the current plan, which is being proposed between Sydney and Newcastle, 320 kilometres an hour, do you think that's an adequate speed? I've seen elsewhere that high-speed rail in other parts of the world can be up to 600 kilometres an hour. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the maglev goes at 500 plus. The fastest traditional high-speed rail, to the best of my knowledge, is Korea, that have high-speed rail operating in the high 300s, around 370 there, with a capability of going up to 425. So by the time we're doing it, if we got cracking and we're doing it in 10 years' time, I think we can comfortably say that we will have trains that will be traveling up to 400 k's and beyond. The limit is the rail. I mean, high-speed rail has to be on a straight line. And when you're looking at Sydney to Newcastle, if you get the right alignment, and I'm still a believer that the train station at servicing Newcastle should be west of Newcastle. The one servicing the Central Coast should be somewhere in that inner Arimba area, not in Gosford, in the centre of Gosford, where you're waterlocked and landlocked, mountains and whatnot, to restrict any growth. It's a silly place to put it. It really is wrong. That if you get those things right, go for it. There's an enormous amount of land that can be released in that Newcastle to Maitland region, huge housing, and you're looking at a big development. I don't think it's necessarily the right first step. You've got geographically the most difficult terrain to deal with, and at the moment you've not got the places where you're going to get this extraordinary uplift through and fund it through value capture. But that should be done independently, not a politician or a political group deciding, we're going to do it from Sydney to Brisbane to begin, Sydney to Newcastle, for some other reason than what is the most economic way to roll this out. And what the high-speed rail people of Japan impressed upon me right from the beginning was that you've got a master plan high-speed rail and you've got to keep it going. It's got to become an industry. You can't do it hodgepodge, piecemeal. That's so expensive. And so therefore you've really got a plan. Yes, okay, it's going to be Melbourne to Sydney, and it's going to be Sydney straight on to Newcastle, and then you work out logistically what is the best way to roll this out, and the most efficient way. One of the bits of evidence that came to us was that the most expensive component of doing major infrastructure in Australia is that they get a project, and these major companies gear up to do a project, and then there's nothing following on. And so the cost of gearing up and gearing down is all apportioned to that one project. Whereas if there was a multiple of projects coming on and a high-speed rail industry that it was going to carry on, and there's going to be jobs and going on and on and on, well, then that cost of gearing up and all that machinery is amortized over a number of projects, and the efficiencies there are then gained. We had a group saying that the way the Pacific Highway had been built between Sydney and Melbourne was like doing a bunch of driveways. It was the most expensive. And they maintained that they could have had 4 lanes going either way and built it in less than 7 years at about a quarter of the cost. And that procurement and rolling out of major infrastructure needs to be taken away from government, because otherwise what happens, you have an accident that happens somewhere happen time and time again on the Pacific Highway, and there's a big announcement. A politician turns up in a hard hat and a yellow vest, and we're going to put a roundabout here that's tragic. Someone got killed, and we're going to build this roundabout, so that'll never happen again. And they motivate. Come on, you needed to have planned the entire highway from Sydney to Brisbane, not done that piecemeal opportunism, political opportunism. It's not good.
Got a question here from David. Who would build this and who would own it? Could the Army Civil take this on?
Don't know about the Army Civil, but look, there's any number of ways, but it's for an independent group to decide. You can go and I was very keen because Japan had offered to partner with us. So I think we had every right to go to Japan and negotiate in good faith to see if we could come to arrangements. They talked about actually building the rolling stock in Australia, so creating jobs, which everybody talks about. That would be nice. When I first went into Parliament, we built all of our rolling stock in Australia, rail rolling stock. Not the case anymore. My last inquiry was something to do with government procurement. It was called a national security imperative to build our capacity rather than sell it overseas. And we discovered the difference between value and cost. And we just take the cheap way all the time. Oh, we can get this railway carriage from China for 500,000. It's going to be $1 million in Australia. Good, we'll buy the one from China. Well, actually, maybe spending twice as much builds our capacity, and there's all sorts of other values. The jobs that are created, the wealth that's staying in Australia, the taxation that's being paid. Maybe it's better to have gone with the Australian company. In Sydney, we have 3 different tram systems. If you look at Canberra, they have another different one, and Newcastle has another different one, and none of them are interchangeable. Fantastic. Isn't that magnificent? We make trams in Victoria. Why didn't we upgrade our capacity and have that common standards delivering our tram systems, our light rail systems in Sydney, Canberra, and Newcastle? This is as bad as what we did, over 100 years ago, 125 years ago, when you had to get off the train in Albury because there was a different gauge between Victoria and New South Wales, and a different one in Queensland. There was something like 7 different gauges. We're slow to learn, and and you'll usually find that at the root of the problem is political decision making or motives.
So tell me a little bit more. I know we're getting towards the end here, but I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. Tell us about the Japanese ambassador that you had some dealings with. Obviously, Japan has an extensive high-speed rail system. You would think that if they are willing to help us implement it here, then you would, your eyes would light up and you'd almost jump for joy, thinking, "Oh, this is a tremendous opportunity." But obviously, your fellow parliamentarians didn't go for it. What happened there?
Well, I went to a function at the embassy. I spent time with Shingo afterwards and talked about some of the inquiries we've done about high-speed rail. And his eyes lit up and he said, "You're the first Australian politician I've ever met who understands why you need high-speed rail in Australia." It's exactly the reason they needed it in Japan in 1964. Tokyo was the most expensive, congested city in the world. And so they used high-speed rail to decentralise and plan their settlement. And it's worked beautifully. And they then planned their plans now. They did the initial planning prior to 1964. Things were confirmed around about 66, 67. And 60 years later, they're running 18 months, 2 years in advance of the rollout of this network of high-speed rail. It's been transformational. And that's what this infrastructure is. It was transformational for Japan. It will be transformational for Australia. And Shingo then took the time to speak at the National Press Club. And I'd really recommend viewing his speech because he took the time. I sent him all of the inquiries we'd done. He talked to me. He said, "Gee, you're absolutely right. You're right on the money." And he's made the offer, which is not consistent with the Japanese culture. They wait to be invited. He made the offer to partner with Australia. And it was part of the Quad 4 agreement. We're militarily aligned. We're closer than close. We're great trading partners. And here's another string of benefit. We will provide you with all of the wherewithal to develop high-speed rail for the benefits that we achieve from high-speed rail through our rolling out of our system. Technology, the wherewithal, they've got more difficult building environment than we have. There's never been a fatality on their high-speed rail system, even when they've had earthquakes, that the trains slow down to a stop and no one gets hurt.
Is there any chance of cutting government out of it as much as possible? Like, could private enterprise come in and build this? Or is it too big of a project?
There was a group called Clara who sought to buy land, zone around it, and build high-speed rail all on their own. they were given something like $8 million government money to prove up their business case. I'm running the parliamentary committee, and I'm begging the minister, please, can I see that? Apparently it was very favourable. But one of the comments from the minister at the time, well, it'd be the worst case situation if they got like halfway done or 2/3 done and then they ran out of money. And I go, really, would that be that bad? So they, through their private efforts, funded 2/3 of the high-speed rail between Sydney and Melbourne. And so if you put in a little value capture mechanism around the train stations that they were proposing, you've only got to fund 1/3 of it. Or even if 2/3 of it is funded privately, it's a pretty good deal, I would think. And yet these things lie dead because of no one's got the political character to run with it and to really work through the issues so you're answering the opposition. But when you look at what happened at the beginning of Anthony Albanese, who's a great friend. I think we played tennis for 10 years, and with Peter Carlisle and Kevin Hogan, we're great friends. We had a real bonding, and we share this love for high-speed rail. But I've lost my track of thought there. But for him, when he failed to get the Indigenous the referendum up, it told you starkly that if you people can't work together, you can't even recognise that our Indigenous people were the first people to come here. You've got a snowflake's chance in hell of getting high-speed rail up until you work in a bipartisan way, that somehow you agree that this is a great thing for housing supply, for housing affordability, for the relieving of congestion in our major cities, the housing costs in our major cities. Work together, do one thing together for the future of our country, rather than just denigrate each other. It's so unedifying when the leaders name call and knock each other. That's why the major parties have gone. When I entered Parliament, they each had 40% of the support. Now they've got less than 30%, and both sides have equally deserved the loss of support for the way they've behaved.
One quick question. Through your inquiries, did you ever look into how long it would take? So if we just said we want a complete high-speed rail between Melbourne and Sydney and then on to Brisbane, what time frame are we looking at? Obviously, you'd build it in stages. You wouldn't build it all in one go, but do you have a time frame of how long it would take?
You never stop. My conversations with JCR was it would take 2 years to get the necessary approvals, 2 years to do the engineering, and from Sydney to Melbourne, 5 or 6 years to build it. So it wasn't, it was a 10 to 12 year project from beginning to end. That part, the next part, is another, 10 years or more to roll out, and parts of it, come into play as you go along. But that we've wasted 40 years and $140,000 in inquiries. The Canadians, now they're good. Canada's a great country. They've decided to go with high-speed rail, and boom, it's happening. They're contracting it right now. Mike Carney, talk to Anthony and tell him how it's done.
Yep. You're in the Parliament for 12 years or so. When you look back on your time in Parliament, are you frustrated, or like how do you look back at being in there, being in Canberra, dealing with your fellow politicians? What are your overall thoughts about your experience in there?
Look, what so many of the general members of the public say, you guys don't have any vision. You don't do anything. And that was my frustration. I thought, in the words of John Howard, we need to develop great policy. And I went to work doing these inquiries and thinking, these policies. And Tony Abbott was all about, saying, we're going to look for ideas. We're going to have a meritocracy. I knew what a meritocracy was because I thought playing for prize money was a meritocracy. If you win the game, you get the prize money. If you don't, you don't. There's an instant reward. And if you did this good work and helped develop great policy that would help us get elected legitimately, not through knocking the other side, but by putting forward better policies that would benefit Australia more broadly, and now and through into the future. And that is the frustration. And that's why I keep hammering these things. Please stop what you're doing. It's not good. Peter Dutton is a very decent guy, fine guy, but it was denigrated time and time again. And he'd hit back the same. Make it a contest of ideas. I mean, his ideas of nuclear, we'll never know whether they're any good because no one ever deals. The first casualty are the facts and the truth. Should nuclear, like high-speed rail, be looked at by an independent assessing group that can actually then implement it at arm's length from government interference?
Look, John, I appreciate you coming on tonight. This is an interview that I've wanted to do for such a long time because, one, I wanted to interview you about this and about your knowledge on this issue, but I've been wanting to advocate for this issue and highlight this issue for a long time because I just see the tremendous benefit in having high-speed rail in this country, and with our geography and with our cities being so spread out, it just seems like a no-brainer to move to this project and as you said, be like Canada and just get stuck in and start building it straight away. It wouldn't be tremendously hard to design, I'm guessing, because you've already done the work. You've done the inquiries. Proposals have already been made. The work's there. It's ready for someone to grab and dust off and get cracking.
Yep. Do not announce where a station is going before you determine the value of the land. And all land in Australia has a value. It's already done. You've just got to say, okay, well, your land has a value on it. And if it's subject to a change of zoning because of infrastructure, and it doesn't just have to be high-speed rail. We looked at a place on Port Phillip Bay where there was the prospect of building a wharf and having a ferry service into the city of Melbourne. And so the land that was government owned right around the wharf would go Worcester up, but the whole area would go up. Value capture. I mean, there was there was Cross City Rail in London raised 30% of the cost of the Cross City Rail because they put a levy on businesses. I think it was Tony Williams who gave evidence, and that was held as a highlight. And people would repeat it time and again. The best you can ever do out of value capture is getting 30% of the project funded. And he gave evidence, and his opening words were so funny. And excuse me while I do my English accent, but I was English for a while. I got kicked out of Parliament for being English. He said, I'm so embarrassed. I get lauded all the time over this. And he said, if I'd only been able to get some of the uplift of the land, we would have funded the whole thing, which has subsequently been done in England. But he was saying that these things can be fully funded by a value capture mechanism. And maybe the decision to go forward should be based on how much of the cost of the infrastructure can be funded in this way. And that determines whether you go forward with it. I often say, well, you only should do high-speed rail if you are funding an acceptable amount of it from value capture.
Okay, thank you so much. We're at the final segment of the show now. The final question is the most important part of Command the Narrative, and that's called Build Your Own Fantasy Government. Now, John, we're going to put you in control of the next Parliament of Australia, and you can choose 5 or 6 people to head up that next Parliament of Australia, put them into government. They can be living or dead. They don't have to be politicians, but 5 or 6 people who you think would be tremendous leaders for this country moving forward. Who do you choose?
Well, I think you'd kick off with Philip Lowe and to say, okay, we're going to put certain infrastructure projects and various important things out of the interference of politicians. Jeff Brunston, who's been a great champion of this, fabulous history in banking and one of Australia's great businessmen and who understands this and has assisted me in my development of my thoughts. I mean, a quality person. Ken Henry, who I've talked to about, we got talking about housing when I did a housing inquiry when I was chair of the Economics Committee, and which led to the planning of settlement and housing supply achieved through that. I thought he was enormously valuable. I don't know how many recommendations he made through the Henry report, but there was only a handful of them taken up. And that was an example of this eminent person, this extraordinary man, has done this incredible study, told us what we needed to do, but politics whittled it down to 1% or 2% of accepting of his work. Had Philip Lowe had his independent body formed, that stuff would have gone there and been acted on for the benefit of the Australian people.
Yeah. And that's what we want. We want politicians in there that will do things to benefit the Australian people and to benefit our nation and our kids and grandkids going forward, and to build on what we've already built in this country. I mean, we have an incredible country, but you mentioned before, like, this country could have a tremendous potential. I mean, it does have a tremendous potential, but we just seem to have been held back by a lack of action more than anything, more than bad decisions. It's a lack of action and lack of long-term planning and vision. And John Bradfield had it when he built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, but we haven't, unfortunately, had anyone since then that has taken that leap to do that in this country.
Look, there's a chap called Mark Burrows, who's one of our most senior decorated bankers. He's been working for years on this phenomenal Watering of Australia project. And even he, with his gravitas and contacts, can't get the traction that's needed to make his thoroughly worked through project happen. And again, it's a value capture. You know, if you've got a acreage farmland and you don't have water, it's got a certain value. Add water and the value goes up enormously. And so there's another opportunity to value capture that type of infrastructure. But you know, you look at Mark Burrows and these people, you know, you've got to grab them while you can. Deborah Hazelton, who was recently the chair of the AMP Bank, when I first went to Japan at my own expense, looking for high-speed rail and to study it, she was involved with JBIC and the banks in Japan, and they were talking about how easy it would be to fund and finance high-speed rail in Australia if there was a mechanism in place. And that goes back to 2011. Deborah is still involved in the Australian High-Speed Rail Association, an extraordinary person, but you know, as frustrated as many of us who just see the opportunity that's going missing.
Yeah, it is frustrating, but we just need to keep chipping away and keep prosecuting the case and getting the information out there, and that's what we hope to achieve tonight. So thank you, John, for coming on and speaking about this. As I said, it's been something that I've been looking forward to for a very, very long time, and hopefully the audience enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please share it far and wide. I do rely on the audience to get this out there and spread our interviews and our information, and maybe send an email to your local parliamentarian and say, look, I just watched this interview with John Alexander and it was fantastic, and maybe we should be putting more pressure on our parliamentarians to have some long-term vision and, you know, maybe transition to a high-speed rail in this country. So thank you for everyone watching, and we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Stephen, for inviting me, and thank you to Warren Stacey.
Yeah, thank you.
Warwick.